Hearing loss and Aboriginal employment. Hi, my name's Damien Howard. I'm a psychologist and educator and have been working in the Northern Territory for many years. Over the last 15 years, I've been working in the area of psychosocial outcomes of Indigenous hearing loss. Up to 80% of Indigenous children and more than half of Indigenous adults in remote communities have some degree of hearing loss as a result of childhood middle ear disease. This is very often a disease of disadvantage in that some children who experience it earlier, longer and more often, and these children very often come from socially and economically disadvantaged backgrounds. Here you can see an image of a crowded house in a remote community, which together with poor nutrition and poor access to medical treatment are key factors in the contribution to high levels of middle ear disease and hearing loss amongst Aboriginal people. Generally, there's awareness among people of the high prevalence of middle ear disease and hearing loss amongst children, but there isn't so much an awareness of the prevalence of hearing loss amongst adults. But the persistent middle ear disease in childhood, which leads to conjunctive hearing loss during childhood and often auditory processing problems consequent of that, and the scarring of the eardrum and the damage to the middle ear structures can lead to some degree of permanent adult hearing loss and auditory processing problems. However, most people's hearing loss is within the mild to moderate range. There are more Indigenous people with some degree of severe and profound hearing loss, but there are very many more people with mild to moderate levels of hearing loss. And people may not be aware that they have a hearing loss, and others are very often not aware that people are hard of hearing. In a study conducted in a remote Aboriginal community, we looked at the prevalence of hearing loss amongst a group of Aboriginal workers, and we found that 60% of the workers that we tested had some degree of hearing loss. That is, 6 in 10 of those Aboriginal workers had some degree of hearing loss that had a significant impact on their communication and their performance in the workplace. Those people with hearing loss had a lower overall performance at work. They also experienced more difficulties in following verbal instructions, had a lower proficiency in oral English in being able to understand and follow instructions. They were slower than others in learning on the job in terms of learning how to do new tasks and understanding what was expected of them at work. They were more often shy and reticent than other workers, and some were more often defensive if their work was corrected. Workers with hearing loss also had more social and emotional difficulties. Those workers experienced higher levels of frustration. They worried more about whether they might get things wrong or whether they understood what was being said. And some of them experienced more depression than other workers. When supervisors discussed their relationship with workers, it was clear that it was workers with hearing loss that they found most difficulty in getting to know and establishing a positive workplace relationship. When they described the few workers who didn't get along with their peers at work, all of those individuals had some degree of hearing loss. However, it's important not to see these associations with hearing loss as only related to the hearing loss. There was a whole range of other factors that were involved in this, many of them related to outcomes of earlier hearing loss. So the repeated conductive hearing loss and auditory processing problems during childhood often made it hard for people to learn English. So they found it hard to learn how to read. So school and participation in training became more difficult. And people with hearing loss more often had social problems and difficulties in interpersonal relationships. This made it more often that they experienced frustration and anxiety in their social relationships, and may be avoidant of situations that they weren't comfortable in, and may even be aggressive more often than others in some situations. So all of that constellation of things that were related to earlier hearing loss interact with current hearing loss to contribute to workplace difficulties. And there are certainly a whole range of other things outside the issue of hearing loss that also contributed to workplace issues. And despite that children's hearing loss being very widely known in this community, none of the supervisors or the employers of these workers had any awareness of the likelihood that some of the workers had a hearing loss. So they were quite surprised at the high level of hearing loss amongst workers. Many of the workers themselves weren't aware that they had a hearing loss because it was how they heard for most of their life. So they had adjusted to that and expected that this was the way that everyone heard. And that lack of awareness of hearing loss and the social effects of hearing loss are very much part of the communication problems that result from hearing loss. So awareness is a very important first step in addressing problems related to Indigenous hearing loss. To illustrate this, you can see on this diagram that when cross-cultural communication is involved, where Western people have talk-only communication skills. They don't have the same rich source of non-verbal communications, of using gesture and intonation in the same way that Aboriginal people do. So they convey information in a way that's more difficult for Indigenous people with hearing loss to understand. And when Indigenous people have difficulty understanding, they are often judged as having limited capacity or lack of motivation, instead of it being understood that hearing loss is involved and that people's difficulty in understanding, especially when there's background noise, is related to that hearing loss and the acoustic environment. The response of people with hearing loss is to see that judgment made about them and then to be reticent to actually ask for help from those people who are making those judgments. So the final outcome is avoidance and reticence in asking for clarification of what has been said. And so the non-Indigenous speaker doesn't understand why people avoid and disengage from them after this process has come about. And this focuses very much on the Aboriginal listener in that circumstance, but what the non-Aboriginal person who is communicating with the Aboriginal listener with hearing loss does, what that non-Aboriginal person does is very important in that communication outcome. Here you can see the communication via talk only and the judgments made about the limited capacity and lack of motivation are very critical factors in the construction of these communication problems. The person's response to seeing those judgments is another component of that interact to contribute to those communication problems. To